ahead and talk what's happening there. So what I want to talk about is where's the learning in games? What is driving game-based learning? And some of you may actually recognize this gentleman here. So I've got related resources, books on the topic. I've got, lynda.com and all that kind of stuff. Just skip over that. You can see that later. But one of the things I want to point out is that I'm actually co-founded of a company called 2K Learning, where I'm working with my partner, Jim Kiggins, to put a lot of these educational actions in play. So I'm not just researching it and talking about it, but I'm actually implementing it and seeing what happens. My thoughts and everything are on my Kapp notes if you ever want to see any of that. But one question that I get asked a lot is, why might an educator use games for learning, right? That's the question that we get all the time. Where's the evidence that games are important? Why might we use games for learning? I think we should ask this question instead, though. Why would an educator use lectures for learning? It actually turns out that the research behind lectures is really scary bad. It turns out lectures are not effective for fostering critical level thinking really at all in any way, shape, or form, which I think is really interesting, because what I'm asked all the time is, prove to me that games are better than, and then you name it, right? Lectures, discussion, whatever. And I always come back with, prove to me that lectures are an effective way of learning. In fact, 78% of lecture time of students is spent in passive thoughts about the subject, or irrelevant thoughts, right? You're kind of looking out the window, or you're thinking of different things. It's not relevant. And during a student's thoughts during a lecture, they only attempted to solve problems or synthesize interrelated information about 1% of the time, right? So there's really not a lot of evidence. And even if we look at class discussions, which we'll look at in a moment, how the typical class. So someone has mentioned, there's some tutors that might disagree with this. Well, if you take the absolute best of lecturing and compare it to the absolute best of games, that's one thing. But what happens is, people take a really good game and they compare it to the average lecture and say, hey, is this game better than the average lecture? But in fact, lectures can be as disineffective as ever. And if you had the choice, you'd want to go toward games. Now, interesting that lectures still have their place. Like, I'm not saying we replace all lectures with games, but if we really want to get to higher level thinking, lectures is not the place. And I'll see about that, why that link's broken. But if you copied that content and pasted it into Google, you might be able to find it. But I'll send out that link there. There were 21 studies that found lecturing to be less effective than discussion, reading, and individual classwork. And lectures are not good if you want to teach higher level thinking. If you want to teach declarative knowledge, apples are red, bananas are yellow, that's a really great. But if you want to teach balancing resources and thinking like that, not so good. So a study, a meta-analysis, which is a study of study done by Tracy Sitzman, found, she looked at serious games / simulations, and found out that instruction with learning games yields higher gains in learning and retention than traditional non-interactive instruction, right? Traditional lecture-based instruction. And here are the numbers that Tracy came up with. So when compared to traditional instruction, game-based learning was 11% more effective than traditional lecture. For procedural-based knowledge, first you do this, then you do this, then you do that, it's 14%. And for overall retention, it's 9%. So it's obvious that games can be very effective for learning, but and we look at lectures at 17% higher than lectures and 5% higher than discussions using game-based learning. But what is it about the games? Is it the points? Is it the competition? Is it the leaderboards? What type of those things are they, right? So the answer is, it's not the game elements at all. It's the level of interactivity. So if you have a high level of interactivity, true interactivity, not a discussion where I ask a general question, you give me a general answer, but a discussion where I actually am forcing you to think critically, that can be as effective, right? Very easy to do there. So the idea, and interactive storytelling, I think, is another really great thing. And there's some really interesting research about the impact of storytelling as opposed to bulleted lists. Um, Storytelling is so much better than a bulleted list. You also need to think about the level of engagement. So typically, when an instructional designer designs instruction, they tend to think content first, activity second. A game developer tends to think activity first, content second. And it turns out that activity is a really good way to learn. So if you can mix up your lectures with some activity, it's really good. But if you're going to be a talking head for a half an hour and you're just going to dump information with bullet point after bullet point after bullet point, it's not going to be an effective way for learning. And games are really going to trump that. In fact, I always say bullets don't kill people, bullet points kill people. So we want to kind of stay away from that, and we want to think of a good, somebody said a good lecture. So we really need to think about what is a good lecture. A good lecture actually involves interactivity. So a pure lecture of just giving content is great for declarative knowledge, memorizing things. It can impact the affective domain sometimes, but sometimes not as effective as interactivity. And in fact, there was a meta-analysis of 225 studies done in the STEM area of research, and it showed that active learning increases average exam scores by as much as 6% and reduces your likelihood of failing by 1.5 times more likely, right? So you need to really think about that where you're actually adding that level of interactivity. Also, games can promote pro-social behaviors. So pro-social behaviors are really kind of interesting. And let's think about some of the research from pro-social behaviors. And so there's a really interesting game called Darfur is Dying. I don't know if anyone's heard of this game. I'm sure most of you have. But there was some really, really interesting research to find out whether or not Darfur is Dying, playing the game, would make you more interested in the situation in Darfur, right? So in the game, you choose a refugee and you play the game as a refugee. So the researchers, Pang, Lee, and Heater did a study and found that they did a couple of experiments. And they found out that the first experiment indicated that playing the game Darfur Dying results in a greater willingness to help the Darfurian people than reading a text conveying the same information. So if you play the game, you're really more involved in wanting to do that, right? So that's really kind of interesting. And there might be a reason why that happens is because you become emotionally involved in the game. And sometimes it can be a positive emotion, sometimes it can be a negative emotion. They also found that with the second experiment, that playing the game Darfur is Dying resulted in greater role taking by the individuals and a greater willingness to help people either than watching someone playing the game or reading the text. So there was a more of an affective domain there, affective result, because people were willing to help more if they actually played the game. So that's one area that games can promote pro-social learning. Another area is a really interesting study that was done. And they took 3 games, a pro-social, a neutral game, and anti-social game. And they did the classic experiment in psychology where they wanted to see if people would help. So they had the person play the game. An experimenter came in, a research assistant came in, knocked over pencils. And they wanted to see, would people help pick up the pencils, right? So that was kind of the result in pro-social behavior. So when they had the people play the game Lamers, I don't know if anybody's heard of Lamers, but it's basically a game where you try to kill all the lame people. You can blow them up, you can shoot them. So when I say it's an antisocial game, I'm not kidding. It's an antisocial game. But 28% of those people that played that game still helped pick up pencils. So you play the game for a little bit, falls over, you still pick up pencils. People that played the neutral game, Tetris, 33% of those individuals helped to pick up pencils. Now, the last game was called Lemmings, where you led lemmings to safety. Very pro-social. You were trying to save the lemmings from certain destruction. 67% of those individuals helped to pick up pencils. So there's definitely an indication that pro-social activities in games influence pro-social activities outside of games. So picking up pencils is kind of low risk, right? Not a big deal. So they did another experiment, and they figured that maybe Lemmings was the world's most effective pro-social game. So they decided to use a game that was called Crisis City. And in this game, you go around and you pick up people with a helicopter. You're saving their lives. They decided not to use the neutral, no Tetris. They still kept the lamer game, but they said, you know what, picking up pencils isn't really that big of a deal, right? So they said, we'll up the ante. What we'll do is we'll have the researcher come in, a male researcher come in, grab a female researcher's arms, they're in cahoot, and say, where have you been? I've been looking for you all day. And then find out whether or not someone would intervene or say something. It's definitely, James, to your question, it's not the format, it's the content. So in the lamer games, 22% intervened. So they either got up, grabbed the researcher, or said something. The people that played the pro-social Crisis City, 56% intervened. So again, playing a pro-social game has pro-social impact outside of the game. And these studies that I cited are not the only ones. There's been lots of research about the positive benefits of pro-social gaming that can really kind of help the situation. How long does that behavior change last? I don't have a research study on that. I have seen some record as much as 15, 20 minutes. I'm not sure beyond that. Certain class content, I'm not sure that question. Second is games, in order to be effective from a learning perspective, need to be embedded into the curriculum, especially from a learning perspective. So here's one of the things that is interesting. Oftentimes people will say to me, hey, Karl, we want to create this learning game so the learners won't even know they're learning. It'll be stealth learning. What turns out from an assessment standpoint or from a learning standpoint, that's the worst possible thing you could do. From a research perspective, games should be taught as part of the curriculum, and students should know what they're going to be learning within the game. So that needs to be done. Yeah, they have looked at pro-social by age, grade. There's a really interesting report out of the East somewhere that they did studies across age groups and across cultures and across genders and found pro-social results at every age, every gender. So that is pretty interesting. So instructional games, and Sitzman's meta-analysis and Robert Hayes did a meta-analysis for the Naval Warfare Center, found out that the games really need to be embedded into the learning curriculum. What you should do is you should tell the learners what they're going to learn, have them play the game, and have them reflect on the learning. In fact, I always say there's no learning without reflection. So you need to go ahead and have the reflection happening. So here's a way you should do it. You should do real world, you should introduce the game. Maybe it's a real world case study or whatever. You play the game simulation or role play, whatever that happens to be, and then you reflect on that. And so that process of setting up the game, playing the game, and reflecting on the game is the process that leads to the most learning. It's the most effective element you can do from a learning perspective. Another interesting study showed that games are more effective than traditional instruction when multiple sessions are involved. So there was a really interesting, in Learning Magazine, Ruth Clark and I got into a discussion, if you will, about the effectiveness of game-based learning versus traditional instruction. What turns out, if you take game-based learning and traditional instruction, oftentimes the amount of learning at the end of playing each one once is about the same. It's really valuable when the game-based learning is played multiple times. That's where the learning from games really comes in. And one of the beliefs is people are spending a lot of time cognitively processing how to play the game as opposed to the content the first time. And the incremental value of rereading or restudying content presented traditionally is not as valuable as the incremental improvement in playing a game over and over again. In fact, Wooters in their meta-analysis found that in the Journal of Educational Psychology, found that conventional structure is typically better in a one-off of game versus traditional, but multiple game sessions lead to deeper, more embedded learning, the ability to recall that learning, and the ability to apply that learning over time is much more effective if you play the game multiple times. And Sitzman found that when learners had access to a game, unfettered access to a game after they've played it the first time, they tended to learn more when they played the game more and more, which makes sense. And one of the things that games are good at is encouraging us to play a game over and over again, right? Because play the same game, you might have, as Jasmine pointed out, different endings, right? And there's some researchers that say we need to come face to face with the fact that playing a game is never the same twice, right? A good, well-designed game, always different things happening every time you go through it. You might try a different strategy, you might try a different answer, you might try a different approach. So their argument is how can we really analyze games if they're different every single time? So we really need to look at games more like situational learning than pure variable-based experimentation, because it's not always possible. Games are different every time you play. So really kind of interesting. Multiple, and as Ben points out, multiple sessions create more opportunities for reasoning, more cognitive processing, variation, more repeated experience. So lots of value in doing it over and over again to understand, or even to experiment with strategies. So for example, in 2008, the Harvard Business Review said, hey, a game like World of Warcraft is an awesome leadership simulation. Why? Because you can try different leadership strategies and see if they work without real world consequences. So it's really kind of interesting how that works. It does address the social element, the affective domain, and also it goes back to a little bit to Bandura's social learning theory, right? If you observe someone playing a game, or you observe how you played a game one time, you can then make changes based on that observation. And then you can play it a little bit differently, which is really kind of an interesting way to approach that and to think about it. So games are also more effective than traditional instruction when the players work in groups. So group-based games work really well. In fact, with serious games, Wooters et al. Found this, that playing individually was still better than traditional instruction. But learners who played in groups tend to learn even more. So if you think about that, that happens an awful lot, right? If you're playing a game with someone, you typically are discussing strategies, you are thinking about next moves, you are contemplate predictive, you're thinking about how your feedback should impact your next move. all those things happen as a result of playing in a group. So it's a really good methodology to put people together to play a game together. And if you think about cooperative games like Pandemic, or you think of games like Forbidden Island, where you each have a different role to play and you share roles, that can become really kind of helpful. So that's really good. So while playing a game, learners will voluntarily do harder problems and more work than not playing a game. So this was a really interesting study that was done by Lee and et al. But he found out that they gave some students a math worksheet and some students a math game. And a math facts game was deployed on a handheld computer, and learners actually completed 3 times the number of problems in 19 days, and they voluntarily increased the level of difficulty. So a game really pulled the learners in, and they weren't doing difficult problems because they had to. They were doing difficult problems because they wanted to. And if you think about somebody mentioned Vygotsky already, if you think of the zone of proximal development, this is an excellent example of how that works, right? So the first few levels in worksheets and in games are, basic math, and then you work your way up and you work your way up and you go up that way. So it's really kind of interesting. But people were more willing to do it when there were game elements surrounding the process and they weren't quote unquote worksheets. The other thing about the handheld game is that it allows you to do it wherever you happen to be and wherever you happen to have the ability to play the game. So it breaks the time, place boundaries of classrooms and really allows you to kind of go from there. So let's look a little bit at specific elements. So that's comparing games to game-based learning. And really what that comes down to, and I think a lot of you have said this already, is it comes down to the quality of the design, right? So if a classroom experience is effectively designed, it's an effective learning environment. Unfortunately, in many areas, a professor walks in to do a lecture, or a teacher walks into a classroom and she's not feeling very well today, or he broke his leg last night, the other day. And so they just kind of go through the motions. A game, because it's instructionally designed, if it is designed correctly, can hold up under different delivery criteria. Now, the same can be true as if you design a bad game, then it could live forever, right? So you have to be careful about the design. But good design, if you take the best of lectures and the best of game design has that little bit of can trump it. But we have had inundated poor lectures, but I would argue we've been inundated a little bit with poor learning games as well, right? We've taken worksheets and we've added, points, or we've done some stuff like that. So it really, I think, is in our responsibility to create well-designed, well-thought-out games that really are not worksheets in disguise or multiple choice in disguise. So what game elements lead to learning? Let's look at a couple of them. One element that we know works really well in instructional perspective is challenge. And oftentimes, traditional instruction doesn't challenge the learner. If you think of a video game, very well from the right, from the very beginning, you're challenged to do something, right? Run your character from point A to point B, or figure this out really quickly, or learn how to do this. So challenge is something that motivates learners. Unfortunately, in a lot of traditional instruction, we've taken the challenge out. We just give the students the learning and we don't challenge them. And then there's no cognitive processing. And I always say, if the students if you don't care about the outcome, they don't care, right? If there's nothing at stake, there's nothing at stake. Like, who cares? So having a challenge can be really, really important. The other thing that games do really well over instructional design often is that games start with an open loop, like rescue the treasure. You don't know if you're going to be able to rescue the treasure or not, right? You're going to figure it out. But a lot of times when we do instruction, we say, you will learn 3 ways to multiply a fraction, right? And there's no ambiguity. There's no challenge to that. There's just kind of, yeah, here's what we're going to do. So we really need to have that challenge to pull people through. Another really interesting is the use of avatars or characters actually turns out to be really effective from a learning perspective. So here's a really kind of interesting case. There was a research study done by Rosenberg and some others where they took 2 people in a virtual environment, 2 groups of people. One group they had fly around like a superhero. One group they had fly in a helicopter. For both groups, they divided those and said, okay, I've got to find the helicopter and I've got to find, I'm touring the city in one group and another group is actually looking for a boy who needs insulin. So they took those people. After they came out of the virtual environment, either a helicopter or a character, they did that same experiment where they knocked over pencils. Every person who was a superhero helped to pick up pencils. Every single person. Not so in the helicopter group. And the average time that the people in the helicopter group picked up pencils was a lot less than the average time of the everybody should be muted if possible. Sue, maybe somebody's really kind of bored or really tired. But flying around as a superhero actually made people more likely to help. And the researchers said that's because as a superhero, there are certain responsibilities that we automatically have as a superhero, and those carry into the physical world. So having people be like really smart, powerful characters in a game can contribute outside the game environment. We don't know how long that lasts, but one of the things that I think about in terms of gamification and about distributed learning, which we know is a really effective factor from learning, is what if every day for 15 or 20 minutes you play this learning game where you're a superhero or where you're doing positive actions? Would that over time influence your behavior? And I think it would. Okay, so let's look at some other elements. Storytelling. So research has found that the human brain has a natural affinity for narrative construction. And when research was done, it showed that we actually learn and retain facts better in a story than we do in a bulleted list. So stories are a really good way to think about relaying information, and many games contain stories. So the story provides the context. It provides the elaboration to hang things on. And another really interesting thing is that, there's a study done of people reading stories. And they put people in an MRI machine. And as they read the stories, they looked at the areas of their brain that lit up. And they found out that when you read about running in a story, the area in your brain related to running becomes active. When you read about about problem solving in a game, that area of your brain lights up. So there's definitely an area of brain-based activity that results from reading stories. So stories are really a great way to do that. So let me talk about some game examples and what were some elements of game examples. So there's this game called Times Attack. And so basically in this game, you're this little character, this little guy down here, and you have to go through this maze, or you're going through many mazes. And it teaches addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, right? So all really kind of different things. And one really interesting thing they found is that they took the pre-test scores of students and they took the post-test scores. And after playing the game for a while, they found that the learning all increased to almost 100% for every single learner. So definitely playing the game increased learning in math skills because of the repetition, because of the activity, because of the elements of the game, and showed some really positive results. Another game that's really interesting is Dragon Box. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dragon Box, probably many of you, but it's a really interesting game. Yeah, Paul, good question about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I'll get that to a minute. I'll get to that in a minute. Students, because it's very interesting. So anyway, students who played at least an hour and a half of Dragon Box achieved mastery over algebra scores. And the really interesting thing in terms of algebra scores is that when you first start playing this game, you don't know that you're doing algebra. You have one box on one side, one box on another, then they cancel that out and work together and really kind of do some interesting things. So 83% achieve mastery of the students who played at least 45 minutes. So algebra, very conceptual, difficult problem to get, but you get more and more pulled into the game by getting doing the activities, enjoying those activities, and then moving on. So it can be a really powerful game. So I want to get a Paul's question about is that extrinsic problem solving is not as effective as intrinsic problem solving in most studies. Really interesting thing about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. It turns out that the scale used to measure in a lot of studies intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is flawed. The scale itself does not allow the person to indicate that they are both extrinsically and intrinsically motivated at the same time. It turns out in most cases, people are externally and internally motivated to do activities, right? Learning is an inherent intrinsic activity. Humans really have a desire to learn until we crush it out of them in preschool, or sometimes we let kids go to kindergarten. But before that, kids are sponges. They want to learn everything that they possibly can because they're internally motivated to do that. It turns out, though, that if you can tie internal and external motivation together, that's the strongest relationship. And it turns out in some studies they found that seemingly extrinsic motivators like grades can eventually become internal motivators. So external can eventually become internal motivators, and grades can become both an external and internal motivator. So there's really kind of interesting thing. Yeah, it's in my book. I hate to do this, but if you look in the gamification of learning and instruction, there's an entire chapter that talks about the research behind extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So check that out if you have a chance. That'll give you some good information about that. So it's really kind of interesting when you think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. They actually work together. They're not as disparate as people believe them to be. And think about it. If you're going for a certificate, yes, you want the certificate, but it also might be because you want a raise. Well, the raise might be extrinsic motivation, right? But you also want to prove to yourself that you can still learn. So that might be intrinsic motivation. So it's really kind of interesting. Okay. Yeah, I agree with you, Randy. Absolutely. There's another game called Dimension M, and it's an educational game for math as well. It's a first-person kind of shooter type of thing, right? And they had an experimental group that played the video game for an 18-week period of time, and they scored significantly higher on district math benchmarks than students in the control group who did not play the game. In fact, the increase in scores for the test group was more than double the increase for the control group. Now, one of the really interesting things, if we look at game-based learning, is time on task. It turns out that game-based learning, one of the reasons why it's more effective than traditional learning is because the learners tend to spend more time on the task. They tend to spend more time playing the game than not playing the game, which makes sense because there's a lot of motivational reasons for people to play games. Here's a game I worked on under a grant with the National Science Foundation. So we used Virtools and created this game called Survival Master, and you had to put some things in there. Yeah, Dan is well-meaning but not well-informed. He took one or two studies, kind of ran with it, and he didn't look at the nuances of extrinsic versus intrinsic. And in fact, again, I'll go back to some of the flawed research. I'll go back to the fact that the two live together. I'll go back to the research that there are many studies that can show motivation from external factors. So the research is not as black and white as some people would have us believe that it is. It's much more nuanced than some of the pundits. He has made a lot of money, and I wish I knew how he did that so I can make a lot of money with my book. But which is more research based than Dan's. But here are some results from right. Well, but they're nuanced. They're too nuanced. You can't. Research is a nuanced practice. It's not a black and white practice. But anyway, Survival Master. So we did this game, and we found out that there's definitely an increase in learning. In some cases, very large increase from the before scores to the after scores. So again, learning can happen. Another one is here's how we embedded some things. Yeah, an extrinsic reward is a point, a badge. It's $1. It's something that you get just for doing something. And extrinsic motivation works really well for things that you didn't want to do initially, but it extincts over time is a problem with pure external motivation. But if you look at games, a lot of people play games not because they get points, badges, or leaderboards. They play games because they have a sense of mastery. They have a sense of control over their decisions. They have a sense of progress, a sense of success, a sense of learning. Those things are all in games, and why people play games, not for points or badges. That's why a poorly designed game where you just add points and badges to activities doesn't give you the same learning effect as if you do some of those other things. So here's a game that we created called ROV Commander, and you control this little ROV thing as it goes around the world, right? And as it goes around the world, you have to put in numbers and you're exploring the world. It's kind of like this constructivist. Exploration is very intrinsic, a desire, those types of things. So here's another example, same game now, but the second level, you have to stay on a track. And on this track, we're measuring velocity and speed. And again, you go into calculating the speed. Now, the neat thing about this is everybody can go at a different pace. So your speed might be different than my speed, but we still each have to calculate it, which is kind of interesting. So as we kind of end up our hour here, I want to try to, this has been awesome discussion over in the discussion board. So I want to try to meet some of that. But things that you need to take away. One, instructional games will only be effective if they're designed to meet specific instructional objectives. It's designed as it's intended. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. While playing a game, learners will voluntarily do harder problems. Instruction with serious games typically yields higher learning gains than conventional instruction. Games can be more effective when they're played in a group than individually. Games are and can be more effective than traditional instruction when multiple sessions are involved. So encourage people to do multiple sessions. Games have to be embedded into the curriculum, because if they're not, that doesn't work. And then finally, games can influence people to behave in pro-social manners. So we can actually get pro-social behavior. So really kind of interesting, I think, results from games and what games can do. And so now some questions that anybody might have, some ways to get in touch with me if you want to get in touch and ask me some of these questions. One of the questions is, yeah, I'm not saying, the other thing I want to point out is I'm not saying like all points, badges, or leaderboards are bad. In fact, if you use points to provide feedback on level of performance rather than completion, the points are really effective from a feedback perspective. So the right use of points, the right use of badges can be highly effective. That's why I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And say, no, we can't do external motivation at all. Actually, there are elements that make external motivation highly effective, especially when it gives feedback on level of performance, not completion. So oh, go ahead, Sue, sorry.
I'm sorry, Carl. Just several people are asking how they can get access to this presentation. We will post it on our YouTube channel. We will also send you that link if you're registered for the conference, and we'll send you the slides as well if you wish. They'll also be posted in SlideShare.
Yeah, and somebody asked about research about adult learners. If you look at Tracy Sitzman's study was all done with adult learners. It wasn't done with anybody in K through 12. And I don't think it was done with college students either, but I don't remember that exactly. But that was based on adult learners. So those results are adult learning based.
Someone asked if we had seen any games developed for use in prisons. I happen to have, for some reason, expertise in this area. I've been at the conference that is all about prison offerings. I did not see one. I saw a couple of board games, one a card game and one a board game, but there has not, to my knowledge, been anything developed for use in prisons, which would be a really terrific application. There is also one prison based in Clackamas in Washington, D.C. that is teaching their prisoners to make games as a rehabilitative kind of program training for them to get jobs somewhere, which is really fascinating. He spoke at the conference at DigiPen in Seattle. If anyone's interested in knowing about that, I'd be happy to send you the information. Just drop me an email at sue@bola.com. That's my personal email. If there's any other questions, I'm sure Carl will try to answer them. This has just been a terrific session, and we will offer the recording and let you all know where to find it.
Yeah, I've seen, Randy, you're the guru. Thank you. So yeah, I have two emails. You can email me at the university or my Gmail account if you're looking for that. Somebody asked, I think, about transferability. ADL did a study about the transferability of simulations. And the key to that was, as long as the cognitive activity in the game or simulation is the same cognitive activity that you want the learner to possess when they're done, there can be transferability. What happens oftentimes, though, is we take a game and we don't do the activities might be the same, but the cognitive activities aren't always the same. We're mimicking things, but we're not actually causing the same thought functions in the game as we want in real life. And then the transferability is a little bit more difficult. So think about, when you design a game from a learning perspective, what the cognitive activities are, and match the cognitive activities in the game to the cognitive activities you want them to do outside of the game. So that's the transferability question. Other questions? What a great group. I really enjoyed everything.
Yeah, I'm finding with the webinars that people are having as much of an exchange and linking up over the chats, which is great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Somebody asked about, is there on the value of using all senses, not just vision, but hearing, on learning and retention? I can't comment on that. I'm sure that research is out there. I haven't seen it in terms of tactile or smell or anything like that, but I'll look into that and see if there's some research in that, or if maybe somebody in the group knows about that research.
Peter Shea is interested in starting a blog where we could chat some more, so that's a possibility this fall we're looking into. I hope some of you will join us at our conference in Pittsburgh, July 21 to 23, and let us know if you have any other ideas for webinars that you'd like to see done, because that's what we're trying to be, is just a service organization. Carl, there's a question here on production quality, whether that's essential.
Yeah,
Or
from
good
from a
enough.
learning perspective, it's kind of interesting. So they've done studies on conversational quality and found that learning is more likely to occur when it's conversational, when it's informal rather than formal. So informal conversation in a game works better than formal. The other one is um, no, the quality, the fidelity doesn't have to be that high. It has to be recognizable, but you're not going to get order of magnitude improvements by having higher degrees of fidelity. So you don't have to have a realistic human to be that realistic. You can to get the point across that it's a human.
That research
Hey,
has
Rand,
been,
great talking to you.
I'm just
Take
going to say,
care, buddy.
that's saying the research about fidelity has been true in video games. The kids just play if they can get it. They love it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the research doesn't show that big of a difference between different levels of fidelity. So you can get away with pretty low fidelity as long as the interactivity and the cognitive activities are valuable and they're really making good decisions. Then the aesthetics, are secondary.
Jessica, send me your question here about getting to Pittsburgh. And if any of you are interested in going and sharing hotel space or something like that, let me know. Also check Airbnb. A lot of educators actually have stayed at Airbnb places in Pittsburgh and found them very inexpensive. Unfortunately, the airline flights are fairly expensive from LA as well for me.
So some of you asked, so these slides will be available. Sue will make the slides available so everybody can have them. And then if you want to go to my blog, I'll put some of the information and links to the studies there too. Or whenever you get that blog off the ground, Sue, let me know. I can contribute to that as well.
Okay, Peter, we'll hear from you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.